They say she was graceful, a wonderful machine to fly. More than 76 years after the end of the Second World War, the revered and beautiful Supermarine Spitfire continues to grip the imagination of aircraft enthusiasts. With its instantly recognizable elliptical wings and the thunderous growl of its Rolls Royce Merlin engine, the Spitfire became a cherished symbol of resistance for the British people against Germany. In the summer of 1940, this graceful machine, along with the Hawker Hurricane, helped save Britain during its darkest hour. George Unwin of 19th Squadron stated, "It was so sensitive on the controls, there was no heaving or pushing, pulling or kicking. You breathed on it." With its phenomenal fighting qualities, the Spitfire was instrumental in re-establishing air supremacy. She was the only Allied aircraft that saw operation throughout the entirety of the Second World War, and was utilised by several Allied forces, notably by the Royal Australian Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, and the United States Army Air Force. I am Liam Smith with Agent Smith Voice Productions, and in today's history video, I enter the cockpit of one of the most beautiful fighter aircraft ever designed, the Supermarine Spitfire. The story of this incredible machine began in 1931 when the Air Ministry issued specification F7-30 for a fighter aircraft to substitute the aging Gloucester Gauntlet, a single-seater biplane fighter for the RAF. R.J. Mitchell, a British aircraft designer working for the Southampton aviation company Supermarine, utilised the technological skills developed from the series of Schneider Trophy seaplanes. The final entry of this series was the Supermarine S6B, and thus marked the culmination of Mitchell's vision to perfect the design of racing seaplanes. The model S6B S1596, flown by Flight Lieutenant George Stanforth, broke the world record airspeed by attaining a staggering speed of 655 kilometers per hour. Here is a recording of R.J. Mitchell discussing the seaplane's design.
In the design of a seaplane of this type, the one outstanding and all-important requirement is speed. Every feature has to be sacrificed to this demand. It is not good enough to follow conventional methods of design. It is essential to break new ground and to invent and evolve new methods and new ideas.
Mitchell's first monoplane fighter aircraft, in response to Air Ministry specification F7-30, was the Supermarine Type 224, which had its first maiden flight on the 19th of February 1934. It was an inverted gull wing design and was powered by a British Rolls Royce Goshawk engine. This engine utilized an evaporative cooling system which allowed the water to reach a temperature exceeding 100 degrees without boiling by keeping it under pressure whilst it circulated through the engine. The superheated water was then boiled off by releasing the pressure, and the steam would then cool in a condenser, which was collected as water and recirculated through the engine. The gull wing configuration was selected so as to shorten the undercarriage and therefore reduce drag. However, this design was known to produce problems with lateral stability. Therefore, wind tunnel testing programs were initiated, which revealed a lack of directional stability, and thus Mitchell enlarged the fin area. Combined with a disappointing speed of 367 km per hour and issues with the evaporative cooling system of the Rolls Royce Goshawk engine, led to the development of a new aircraft, the Type 300, also known as the K5054 prototype. With the backing of Supermarine's owner Vickers Armstrong, Mitchell and his team commenced work on refining the design of the K5054, the first official prototype of the Supermarine Spitfire. There is this myth that R.J. Mitchell had constructed the Spitfire with a notebook and pencil, but in actuality at Supermarine he had with him some of the most influential minds who had phenomenal knowledge on high-speed flight. This proved to be highly invaluable when the design of the K5054 prototype commenced. However, during this time, Britain wasn't the only nation that was making huge advancements in aviation design. In Germany, a sinister political force, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or more infamously known as the Nazi Party, had assumed total power in the country in 1933. Not only were they assembling highly advanced fighters, but also fast bombers. The increasing threat of these swift developments and the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy meant that the Geneva Displacement Conference, established from February 1932 to 1934, was considered irrelevant. Britain needed a superb fighter aircraft. In December 1934, at Farnborough Airport in Hampshire, Mitchell and his brilliant team were hard at work designing the K5054 Spitfire prototype. After the failed 224, Mitchell wished to refine the wing design of the new aircraft and make it as sleek and fast as possible. It was during this process of my research that I found some fascinating information regarding the Spitfire's iconic elliptical wing. In November 1929, a young Canadian aerodynamicist, Beverly Shenston, received a position with Junkers in Germany. He met Ludwig Prandtl, a fluid dynamicist and aerospace scientist. In 1918, Prandtl had published various works on aerodynamics from the First World War, and surprisingly, one of the wing designs that Prandtl had envisioned is shaped as an ellipse. In this drawing that I've featured here, you can see there is a narrow ellipse on the top and a much deeper ellipse underneath. This looks almost geometrically identical to the wing design that is so prominent on the Spitfire. Eventually, when Shenston travelled to England in May 1931 and received a position at Supermarine, he presented this design to R.J. Mitchell. So, needless to say, the Spitfire's wing is in fact a German design. Besides the unique wing shape, the prototype was fitted with refinements such as a retractable undercarriage and a fine-pitch wooden two-bladed propeller to provide more power during takeoff. On March 5, 1936, the K5054 was ready for its first maiden flight. At the controls was Captain Joseph Mutt Summers, the chief test pilot for Vickers, whose famous quote was, "Don't touch anything," upon landing. Just 5 days later, on the 10th of March 1936, the undercarriage was retracted for the first time, and also received an upgraded wooden propeller, which allowed the Spitfire to achieve a top speed of 557 km per hour. Sadly, the Spitfire's chief designer, R.J. Mitchell, would never live to see his creation fight in the Second World War. Dogged by ill health throughout his time on the project, R.J. Mitchell tragically lost his battle with cancer at the age of 42 on June 11, 1937. The following year, the role of chief designer was handed over to Joseph Smith. Before he passed away, Mitchell had seen one official complete design of his masterful creation, and with the knowledge that 300 of the aircraft were in order for the RAF. Powering this first prototype was the iconic Rolls Royce Merlin engine, originally designated as the Rolls Royce PV12 V12 engine, which generated 990 horsepower. This would increase in power output as the years progressed. These early engines consisted of a float carburetor that not only provided sufficient horsepower, but also had a design flaw which the German fighter pilots were able to exploit. I'll discuss this flaw later on in the video. In this incredible section of archive footage, you can see the manufacturing of the Merlin engine in the factories. And speaking of such an iconic engine, the Rolls Royce Merlin has a unique sound that is regarded by many warbird enthusiasts to be one of the most beautiful noises ever heard from a fighter aircraft. I mean, just listen to this. Not only did the Spitfire require an engine to deliver the horsepower necessary for high-speed flight, a key feature of this fighter lay in its armament. Like the Hawker Hurricane, the Spitfire was originally supposed to have 4 machine guns, but in the run-up to World War II, all of this would change. Historian Stefan Bungay stated, "Pilots reckoned that they could keep their sights on the enemy for 2 seconds, so they had to find a way of bringing down a bomber in 2 seconds. Whilst the Spitfire and Hurricane were still under development, there were 2 choices of armament to be fitted into these aircraft: the light 303 Browning machine gun and the much heavier French 20mm Hispano cannon. In 1934, the Air Ministry was persuaded by Captain Frederick William Hill to place not 4, but 8 light 303 Browning machine guns into the wings of the Spitfire and Hurricane. This firearm was an adaptation of an American design, and during World War II, the Browning armed a variety of British aircraft. To bolster this claim, Hill turned to the most unlikely source, his 13-year-old daughter Hazel. Hazel was an only child, an exceptionally talented mathematician, and a very meticulous worker. She had a close relationship with her father, and she provided the calculations necessary for the implementation of the 303 Browning machine guns into the wings of the 2 fighter aircraft. By placing 8 of these machine guns with a .303 rifle caliber bullet, the same caliber that soldiers fired out of their rifles, meant that these 8 light machine guns, firing 1,000 rounds a minute, would produce a density of fire 256 rounds in the 2 seconds it was assumed that a pilot needed to bring down an enemy bomber. This is an original recording from World War II of Browning machine guns firing from the wings of a Spitfire. The second weapon arming the Spitfire and Hurricane was the French 20mm Hispano cannon. This firearm was later added in response to the Germans placing more armor on their bombers, because the hitting power of the 303 Browning machine guns wasn't as effective. The Hispano cannon was large, and whilst it packed a punch capable of demolishing an enemy aircraft, it was difficult to find room to fit these heavy weapons into the early Spitfire and Hurricane models due to the shorter wing length and mounting. However, after some experimentation and lengthening of the wing in the later Spitfire and Hurricane variants, there was enough room to allow the aircraft to carry alongside and eventually substitute the 303 Browning machine guns with these 20mm cannons. The Spitfire Mark I was powered by a Rolls Royce Merlin 3 engine, which delivered up to 1030 horsepower at max speed. Whilst it originally operated a 2-bladed propeller, this was eventually changed to a 3-bladed 2-position metal propeller, which greatly improved takeoff performance and maximum speed. It could also reach a speed of 583 km per hour with a service ceiling of 34,000 feet. The Spitfire Mark I would be first delivered during the summer of 1938 with the 19th Squadron at RAF Duxford. In June 1940, it fought Luftwaffe fighter and bomber aircraft over Dunkirk. When the Battle of Britain commenced in July 1940, the Spitfire achieved a legendary status as a fighter and bomber interceptor. Eventually, in April 1941, the Spitfire Mark II entered service. Like its predecessor, the Mark I, this new variant carried 8 Browning machine guns, but it was not until the second variant of the Mark II, the Mark IIB, did the armament change to 4 Browning machine guns and 2 20mm Hispano cannons. Not only that, the Mark II also featured a more powerful Rolls Royce Merlin engine, the Merlin 12, which increased the power output to 1,175 horsepower. The Mark II had a maximum speed of 571 km per hour, as the performance was offset with the acquired weight of the 20mm cannons. In actuality, whilst the Spitfire achieved a claim to fame with the public conscience during the Battle of Britain, it was the Hawker Hurricane that was more numerous, and although slower and unable to reach the same altitudes, were more robust. When dogfighting above the skies of England, the Hurricanes usually went for the enemy bombers, whilst the Spitfires took on the German fighter aircraft. This is a quote from RAF pilot Geoffrey Page, who flew both of these aircraft. "I was lucky because I had the unique experience of being one of the very few pilots during the Battle of Britain who had flown both the Hurricane and the Spitfire. They were both lovable, but in their different ways they were delightful aeroplanes. If anything, the Hurricane was slightly easier. It wasn't as fast and didn't have the rate of climb, but during the actual Battle of Britain itself, what really evolved was that the Hurricanes would attack the German bomber formations, and the Spitfires, because of their extra capability of climbing, they would go up and attack the German fighter escorts. But in the earlier stages, I found that we were getting involved with both bombers and fighters when we were flying Hurricanes." The next variant of a Spitfire to see combat service with the RAF was the Spitfire Mark V. It was produced in greater numbers than any other single Mark of Spitfire, served on all battlefronts particularly during the Siege of Malta, and supplied countries including the Soviet Union and the United States later in the war. It's interesting to note here why the RAF didn't produce a Mark III variant of Spitfire into combat. This was due to testing of new design elements, which weren't ready at the time, but would eventually incorporate later Spitfire variants in the war. The early Mark V variant of the Spitfire, the Mark V-A, was designed with the exact same airframe and wing design as the Mark I, but featured the more powerful Rolls Royce Merlin 45, which could produce 1,440 horsepower. It was also the first variant of Spitfire to not only carry bombs, but also have drop tanks to carry extra fuel. Initially, it had a 30-gallon model and later an 80-gallon version. One of the most notable RAF pilots who flew this first variant was Douglas Bader, credited with 22 aerial victories. He lost both of his legs in a flying accident in December 1931, and became lifelong friends with famous Bf-109 fighter ace Adolf Galland. After the war, Bader retired from the RAF and resumed his career in the oil industry. He also campaigned for the disabled and was appointed a Knight Bachelor for services to people with a disability. He passed away at the age of 72 on the 5th of September 1982. The Spitfire Mark V-B, on the other hand, was redesigned with a new wing type and became the standard production version of Mark V's. The main difference between these two variants was that the Mark V-A had 8 303 Browning machine guns instead of 2 20mm Hispano cannons and 4 machine guns. Douglas Bader chose to fly the Mark V-A instead, as it was his opinion due to his tactics of using a close-in approach, as the lower caliber machine guns provided a higher density of fire. The first deployment of the Mark V-B came on the 7th of March 1942, when 16 of this variant were dispatched to the island of Malta via the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle during Operation Spotter. On Malta, the Mark V-B was used to hold off the Bf-109 fighters, whilst the Hawker Hurricanes attacked the lower-level bombers. It was during May 1940 that the Spitfire would come face to face with its Luftwaffe equivalent, the iconic Messerschmitt Bf-109. In the early variants, the Bf-109, such as the E and F models, was generally regarded as superior to contemporary variants of the Spitfire. When it came to level flight, there was little to discern from either model. During test flights of the two fighters, it was revealed that the Spitfire could achieve a speed of 587 km per hour, whilst the Bf-109 could reach speeds of 570 km per hour. But what set these two awesome fighters apart, however, was that the Spitfire had greater maneuverability in terms of higher rate of turn, a smaller turning circle, and it could perform well at high altitudes of 20,000 feet than the Bf-109. This was because the Rolls Royce Merlin engine supercharger could operate at full capacity at a higher critical altitude. A unique feature of the Spitfire's cockpit was that the canopy wasn't narrow, unlike in the Bf-109, which allowed a better field of vision. The Bf-109, on the other hand, was powered by a Daimler-Benz 601 engine. It performed exceptionally well at medium to low altitudes, which is where much of the dogfighting occurred early in the war. Another feature of this German fighter was that the armament was superior to the Spitfire. Unlike the 303 Browning machine guns mounted in the wings, the Bf-109 was equipped with 2 cowl-mounting 7.90mm MG-17 machine guns and the destructive firepower of 2 MG FFM 20mm cannons, 1 in each wing. During the Battle of Britain, these fired a powerful steel cartridge exploding mine shell. Some were even equipped with an MG-FF 20mm cannon firing through the propeller shaft, but in these earlier models, they were unreliable as the vibration from the engine along with the recoil and overheating of the cannon caused it to jam. Another problem with these 20mm cannons was that they had a slower rate of fire than the Browning machine guns, a lower muzzle velocity, and only carried 60-round drum magazines. I was also able to find an audio sample of these 20mm cannons firing from a Bf-109. Listen to this. The Bf-109 possessed a better rate of climb and dive speed, along with other technological advancements. Besides its armament, its Daimler-Benz 601 engine was equipped with an automatic variable speed supercharger that enabled more power output from the engine. For instance, the supercharger in the Bf-109 E3 gave it a 200 horsepower advantage over the Spitfire Mark I. But the most advanced part of the Daimler-Benz 601 engine in the Bf-109 was its fuel injection system. One of the flaws in the Spitfire's design was the float carburetor in the early Rolls Royce Merlin engine. When the aircraft performed a negative G maneuver such as pitching into a dive, fuel would flood the throttle valve and the float would be forced downwards. The Bf 109 fighter pilots quickly caught on to this particular engine flaw because black smoke would puff out of the engine whenever the Spitfire flipped over. The engine would only stall out for a moment, but during a dogfight, it was all a Bf 109 needed to escape or get on the tail of the British fighter. To negate this problem, Spitfire pilots would have to perform a split S maneuver. The fix that eventually countered the Rolls Royce Merlin engine's issue came from a British engineer and motorcycle enthusiast, Beatrice Schilling. She placed a ring inside the engine to restrict fuel flow to the minimum amount necessary. Although this wasn't a complete solution to the problem, it allowed RAF fighter pilots to perform quick negative G maneuvers without loss of engine power. The device quickly drew comparison to a diaphragm and was referred to as Miss Schilling's orifice. In late 1941, the RAF would receive a very nasty surprise when the formidable Focke-Wulf 190 appeared over the English Channel. This highly advanced fighter was equipped with an air-cooled BMW 801 radial engine, which had a power output of 1,700 horsepower and a top speed of 680 kilometers per hour. I mean, just listen to the awesome sound of this BMW radial engine. It sported two fuselage-mounted 7.90mm MG machine guns and two wing-mounted 20mm MG 515 cannons. In the months following the introduction of the new fighter, the RAF realized that the capture of an airworthy example was of the utmost priority. On the 23rd of June 1942, a remarkable coincidence took place that forestalled any planned operation to bring the fighter back to England. A Focke-Wulf 190A3, piloted by Armin Faber, mistook the airfield at Pembrey in South Wales to be a German airfield. Following an engagement with Spitfires over the English Channel, in which two Focke-Wulf 190s were lost, he performed a victory roll and, in his cocky state of mind, extended his landing wheels while inverted and touched down. He was quite shocked and humiliated when he was taken into custody by British troops. The British press was soon to arrive at the scene to film an amusing and cheeky propaganda newsreel.
Very interesting indeed. Something we've been wanting to examine for some time, the Focke-Wulf 190. The RAF forced it down on the south coast of England, where an armed patrol promptly grabbed the pilot before he could do any damage. Now it's in the RAF. The latest German fighter to be met in combat by the RAF, the FW190 is a good machine. It has a speed of 375 at 18,000 feet. A very intriguing prize. No doubt the Luftwaffe chiefs take a poor view of the pilot's failure to destroy it when he landed.
The capture of Faber's Focke-Wulf 190 enabled the RAF to fly test comparisons with a Spitfire MK V. Carrying British camouflage, the captured fighter confirmed the RAF's worst fears. The Focke-Wulf 190 was superior in climbing and diving speeds at all heights. The aircraft had an exceptional roll rate, and when attacked by the Spitfire, this superiority enabled it to flick into a diving turn in the opposite direction. However, when it came to turning circles, it was discovered that the Spitfire could easily outturn it during a dogfight. In order to counteract the issues such as roll rate and altitude performance, the Spitfire's wings were clipped to provide a tactical edge when dogfighting in the Focke-Wulf 190. As an avid Spitfire enthusiast, I personally don't like the wings sheared off. It looks more beautiful with those graceful elliptical wings. The highly advanced BMW 801 radial engine was analysed extensively, which enabled the RAF to provide significant improvements to the Rolls Royce Merlin engine by replacing the float carburetor with a pressurised carburetor in the Spitfire Mark V and the newly developed Spitfire Mark IX. Essentially, this new system operated on pressure alone, which meant that gravity no longer had any effect when performing negative G manoeuvres. For that reason, the pressurized carburetor operated reliably when the aircraft was flying in any altitude. This can be seen as a type of fuel injection. The next variant of Spitfire to see service with the RAF was the Supermarine Spitfire Mark IX. It was a significant improvement over the Mark V and had a top speed of 658 km per hour. It was powered by the Rolls Royce Merlin 61 and was eventually phased out in favour of the Merlin 63 and 70. Its service ceiling rose dramatically from 36,000 feet to 43,000 feet. And it could climb 4,000 feet a minute. The propeller of the aircraft was also changed from 3 blades to 4, which allowed the fighter to have more forward thrust. The Mark IX was also flown extensively against the Luftwaffe's newest fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190, and it was discovered that the two aircraft had very similar capabilities. On July 28, 1942, the first official combat mission for the Mark IX was fought in Le Havre. 12 Spitfires from No. 64 Squadron conducted a fighter sweep over enemy territory. Among the 12 Spitfires was Spitfire BR-601, one of the most significant surviving Allied fighters in the world. She operated in 116 combat missions and was flown by 2 aces, Australian Tony Gaze and New Zealander Colin Falkland Gray. On October 11, 1942, Tony Gaze was piloting Spitfire BR-601 on a fighter sweep to St. Omer when he encountered a Focke-Wulf 190. He said, "Bloody near rammed it. If I'd had a gun camera, it would probably have confirmed this, as there were more than a dozen strikes on the wing roots and fuselage. But I broke away too sharply to watch it go down, as his number 2 was too near for comfort." During the course of the war, there were 3 models of Mark IXs developed. The standard version was called the F Mark IX, using the Rolls Royce Merlin 61, which was only produced until 1933. The second variant, called the LF Mark IX, was implemented with the new Rolls Royce Merlin 66. This had a better performance at slightly lower altitudes than the previous Merlin engine. Finally, the last variant was designated the HF Mark IX, with the Rolls Royce Merlin 70 engine, which provided an improved performance at high altitude. The majority of the Mark IXs consisted of the C-wing type. This wing carried 4 20mm Hispano cannons, or 2 20mm Hispano cannons, and 4 303 Browning machine guns. In 1944, some of the Mark IXs were issued with the E-wing type. This replaced the light 303 Browning machine guns with 2 very powerful American heavy M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns. You can see here in this photograph the difference of the 2 armament and the wing layout. On the left is the 20mm Hispano cannon, and on the right is the M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun. The Mark IX was originally developed as a stopgap measure in response to the Focke-Wulf 190, but I also wanted to briefly discuss other Spitfire variants which I didn't even know about, such as the Mark VI, Mark VII, and Mark VIII. The Mark VI was designed as a high-altitude fighter to counter the threat of high-flying aircraft such as the Junkers Ju-86. The most distinctive feature of this model was the extended wingtips, which were created to increase its performance at higher altitude. 97 of these aircraft were produced between December 1941 and October 1942. Some of these were sent to fight in the Middle East, whilst the majority of them stayed in Britain. The Mark VI was not well received by Spitfire pilots because the pressurized cockpit had to be locked into place and its handling was outperformed by the previous Mark Vs. It was eventually withdrawn from frontline service. The next model in the series, the Mark VII, was a pressurized fighter, and the system it used was more advanced than the previous model, as the cockpit canopy could be slid back rather than being locked into place. Not only that, it was powered by a new variant of the Rolls Royce Merlin engine, the Merlin 71. In order to provide room for the new engine, the fuselage had to be lengthened, and it also required a special cooling fan system. The Mark VII remained in service from 1943 until the beginning of 1944. Only 140 were built during this time. Finally, the last model was the Mark VIII. It was the first variant of Spitfire to receive a completely redesigned cockpit, which comprised of a cut-down rear fuselage and a special bubble canopy for improved rearwards visibility. This cockpit was seen later in Mark IX's and Griffin models. The Mark VIII featured a strengthened fuselage, a retractable tail wheel, two 14-gallon self-sealing fuel tanks, and an increased 96-gallon fuselage fuel tank. 1,657 were produced throughout the war, but it never fully replaced the Mark IX because the success of this variant reduced the importance of the Mark VIII. One such engagement the Mark VIII operated in was the defense of Darwin in 1942 against the Japanese by the Royal Australian Air Force. The Spitfire Mark XII saw operational service in February 1943 and was the first official variant to utilize the more powerful Rolls Royce Griffin engine. The Griffin was a development of the R Sprint engine that was used in the Schneider Trophy seaplanes. The Spitfire that eventually became the Mark XII was developed with a Mark II airframe. The Merlin engine was replaced with a Griffin II engine. It had a single-stage 2-speed supercharger and it produced 1,735 horsepower. The airframe needed to be strengthened so it could handle the increased power of the new engine. And speaking of sounds, let's have a listen to the differences between the Merlin and the Griffin engine. The next variant, the Spitfire Mark XIV, was the most vital Griffin-powered Spitfire and was the only one to see extensive wartime service. It reached staggering speeds of 717 kilometers per hour, and it used the 2-speed 2-stage supercharged Griffin 61 engine, which produced 2,050 horsepower, which increased its performance at higher altitudes. The propeller was modified yet again to incorporate 2 more blades due to the immense increase in horsepower. In some models, the propeller was slightly changed so that 3 blades were in front and 3 behind. These were known as contraprops. The fuselage was based on the Mark VIII and utilized the E-wing model. The superior performance of the Mark XIV made it the ideal candidate to combat the menacing German V-1 flying bomb, the first of the Vergeltungswaffen, or retaliation weapons. Number 91 Spitfire Squadron was credited with shooting down 184 V-1 flying bombs. The last variant of Spitfire to see service in the Second World War was the Mark XXI. This variant utilized a new wing design, which lost the curve of the iconic elliptical wing that is so prominent on earlier marks. This change was such a major deviation that the resulting aircraft was named as the Victor. Aside from this change in wing design, the fuselage and bubble canopy still retained the same shape. The Mark XXI entered service with the RAF in April 1945 and was not entirely successful, as tests revealed that the aircraft was not entirely stable during flights. Only 120 were built, and they remained in service until 1953. The last Spitfire model made was the Mark XXIV, appearing in November 1946. This beast of a machine was able to carry rocket projectiles, and 81 were built. It saw service in Malaya after the conclusion of World War II and remained operational with the RAF until 1952. Last but not least, I would like to finish off this video with a beautiful quote from Mary Ellis. She flew over 1,000 of 76 different aircraft, including Hurricanes, Spitfires, and Wellington bombers. The Spitfire was just like a dancing fairy. It was gorgeous. I can't really explain it. It was absolutely wonderful. Next time, in my history videos, Yamato versus Taffy Free, the Battle of Samar. Thank you so much as always for watching, and I do apologize for taking so long to write this video. I wanted to provide some fascinating little known information and make this historical video as epic as possible. And don't forget to give us a like and to subscribe for more content. Finally, to my awesome subscribers, I want to thank you for your contribution, ongoing support. It really means the world to me. Liam Smith with Agent Smith Voice Productions. Until then, stay tuned. I'll see you next time.